She inherited her grandfather's old farm and just wanted to sell it. Before the deal, she decided to dismantle the corn crib and found something that had been hidden for many years. One discovery turned the history of her family and the entire town upside down. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped between utility bills and advertisements, its envelope heavier than it needed to be, as if the paper itself carried weight beyond ink and stamps. She noticed it only because her name was written in a careful, formal hand she did not recognize, the kind that suggested offices with quiet hallways and clocks that ticked too loudly. For a moment she considered setting it aside. She had learned, over the years, to delay unpleasant things, to place them gently at the edge of her attention and return to them later when the day felt less fragile. But something in the stiffness of the envelope resisted neglect. It demanded to be opened. The letter informed her, in precise and impersonal language, that her grandfather had died 2 weeks earlier. It expressed condolences in a paragraph that sounded practiced, then moved quickly to the practical matter of inheritance. The farm was hers. All of it. The land, the buildings, the remaining equipment. There were no conditions attached, no shared ownership, no complicated clauses. The lawyer wrote as if this were the most natural conclusion to a life, as if property simply flowed downhill from one generation to the next, without friction or memory. She read the letter twice before it settled into meaning. Her grandfather. Dead. The word felt abstract, almost theatrical, as though it belonged to a story she had once heard, but never quite believed. He had always existed in a strange category in her mind, neither fully alive nor gone, a figure who lived somewhere outside the present. He had been old for as long as she could remember, old and silent, and surrounded by rumors that no one ever explained. In family conversations, his name had functioned like a closed door. You acknowledged it, then moved on. There was no sharp grief, no rush of sorrow. What she felt instead was a quiet, unsettling emptiness, the sense of something ending that had never properly begun. She had not seen him in years. Phone calls had been rare, visits even rarer. Distance had become habit, and habit had hardened into something that looked like indifference, but was, in truth, a form of self-protection. Loving him had always seemed complicated, tangled in questions she was never allowed to ask. The farm lay several hours away, in a rural pocket she had left behind, as soon as she was old enough to understand that staying would mean becoming small in ways she could not yet articulate. She remembered the road only in fragments, stretches of fields, a gas station that smelled of oil and coffee, the long turn where the trees closed in and the sky narrowed. She had not planned to return. Her life had moved elsewhere, into cities with noise and anonymity, into work that demanded long hours and left little room for reflection. The farm belonged to another version of herself, one she had outgrown. Her brother had called her that evening, his voice cautious, as if approaching unstable ground. He had already heard the news. The lawyer had contacted him as well, if only to confirm that he had no claim. He sounded relieved when he said it, and she did not blame him. He had made his decision years ago, turning his back on the place with a certainty she had never fully achieved. To him, the farm was a burden soaked in old shame, a reminder of stories whispered too softly to challenge. He wanted nothing to do with it. "You can sell it," he said, after a pause that stretched too long. That's probably what he wanted anyway. She did not know if that was true. Her grandfather had rarely spoken of what he wanted. He had lived alone on that land for decades, watching it decay around him, maintaining just enough to keep it standing. Selling it would be sensible, logical. She agreed with him easily, grateful for a solution that required no emotional investment. 2 days later, she packed a small bag and drove out of the city before dawn. the road empty and pale beneath the early light. The farther she went, the more the landscape flattened and opened, the buildings thinning until they gave way to fields and stretches of land that seemed to breathe. The radio faded in and out, stations dissolving into static. By the time she turned onto the final road, a narrow strip of asphalt bordered by fences leaning at tired angles, she had fallen into a silence that felt both familiar and uncomfortable. The farm appeared gradually, not as a single revelation, but as a series of confirmations. The fence first, its paint long gone, posts warped and half sunk into the ground. Then the house, sagging slightly to one side, its windows dark, its porch boards uneven beneath her feet when she stepped out of the car. It looked smaller than she remembered, or perhaps she had grown larger in ways that distorted memory. Time had worked quietly here, eroding without drama. Inside the house, dust lay thick on every surface, undisturbed except for narrow paths where her grandfather must have walked. The air smelled of old wood and something faintly sweet, like dried grain. Furniture stood where it had always been, worn smooth by decades of use. There were no signs of recent struggle, no evidence of illness beyond the stillness itself. It was as if he had simply stepped out and forgotten to return. She moved through the rooms slowly, touching nothing at first, letting the place assert itself. Each object seemed to carry weight disproportionate to its size, as though the years had condensed into matter. She felt like an intruder, a temporary visitor in a life that had never quite included her. Outside, the land stretched in all directions, fields overgrown with weeds that reached toward her knees, their seeds clinging to her jeans as she walked. Rusted machinery sat where it had last been used, half consumed by grass. The barn leaned but did not collapse, its doors hanging open like tired arms. Everything bore the marks of neglect, but not of abandonment. Someone had been here until the end, keeping the place alive by sheer persistence. Then there was the corn crib. It stood a short distance from the barn, taller than the surrounding structures, its wooden slats weathered but intact. Unlike the house and fields, it looked maintained, purposeful. The roof was solid, the supports firm. Through the gaps in the wood, she could see the pale yellow of dried corn, packed densely inside, more than she would have expected after so many years. The sight stopped her. It made no sense. Corn was meant to be harvested, sold, used. Letting it sit year after year served no practical purpose. She walked around the structure slowly, studying it from every angle. The ground beneath it was worn smooth, as if he had stood here often, perhaps more often than anywhere else on the farm. The thought unsettled her. Why preserve this, of all things, when everything else had been allowed to decay? By late afternoon, fatigue settled into her bones. She sat on the porch steps and called a local real estate agent, leaving a message that was brisk and impersonal. She asked about selling farmland, about timelines and valuations, about what needed to be cleared before listing. It felt good to reduce the place to logistics. Plans gave shape to uncertainty. That night, she slept poorly in the old house, waking to unfamiliar sounds and the persistent sense of being watched by the past. Morning light revealed dust motes drifting through the air, slow and deliberate. Over coffee brewed on a stove she barely trusted, she made a list of tasks. Clear out the house, assess the equipment, get rid of anything that would complicate a sale. The corn crib topped the list. The corn was useless now, too old for anything but animal feed, and even that would require sorting and hauling. She considered burning it, then dismissed the idea as excessive. Giving it away seemed easier. There were still farmers in the area who might take it, if only to save on costs. Clearing it would make the land more presentable, less haunted by evidence of neglect. As she stood again before the corn crib, hands on the rough wood, she felt a flicker of hesitation she could not explain. It passed quickly, swallowed by practicality. She had come here to finish things, not to linger. The sooner the farm was emptied, the sooner she could leave. She did not yet know that the structure she intended to dismantle was the only part of the farm her grandfather had truly protected, or that the silence surrounding his life had been carefully built, layer by layer, like the corn packed tightly inside. She only knew that something had been left behind, waiting, and that by deciding to clear it away, she had already crossed a line she would not be able to see until it was far behind her. She began early the next morning, before the sun had fully lifted itself above the line of trees. The air was cool and still, carrying the faint smell of damp earth and old wood. Standing in front of the corn crib, she told herself again that this was simply work, no different from clearing out an attic or sorting through boxes after a move. Objects, once stripped of sentiment, were just objects. Grain was grain. Wood was wood. The past, she reminded herself, had no physical weight unless one chose to give it form. The corn crib loomed quietly, its tall frame casting long shadows across the ground. Up close, the structure revealed a care that surprised her. The boards were weathered, but solid, reinforced where they needed to be, repaired at the joints with patient attention. Someone had returned to this place again and again, tightening what loosened, replacing what rotted, ensuring that it endured. It did not resemble the rest of the farm, which bore the marks of gradual surrender. This building had been preserved. She pulled on work gloves and slid the door open. A dry, almost sweet smell rushed out, thick and unmistakable. Inside of the space was packed tightly with corn on the cob, stacked in layers that rose higher than her head. The cobs were pale and brittle, their husks curled inward, whispering faintly when disturbed. Dust floated in the slanted light, settling on her sleeves and hair. She started methodically, lifting armfuls of corn and dropping them into empty crates she had dragged inside. The work was repetitive and heavy, the kind that forced the body into rhythm and left the mind free to wander. Sweat gathered at her temples despite the cool air. Her arms ached, then settled into a dull, manageable burn. Time stretched and folded in on itself, marked only by the gradual lowering of the piles around her. As she worked, thoughts of her grandfather surfaced uninvited. She remembered him standing at a distance during her childhood visits, watching rather than participating, his hands always busy with something small and precise. He had spoken little, and when he did, his words were careful, measured, as if each one had to justify its existence. She had never known how to speak to him. Now, surrounded by the evidence of his labor, she wondered what it had cost him to maintain this place alone. By mid-morning, she had cleared enough to notice a change. The deeper layers of corn felt different beneath her hands. The cobs were arranged more tightly, packed with a deliberate precision that went beyond storage. She paused, fingers resting against the dry husks, and frowned. It was subtle, but undeniable. Someone had been intentional here. She continued more slowly, paying attention now. The light shifted as the sun climbed higher, illuminating the back of the crib in a pale glow. It was there, near the rear wall, that her hand struck something solid beneath the corn. Not wood, not the rough give of dried grain, something smooth, resistant. Her first thought was an old tool, perhaps forgotten and buried. She cleared around it carefully, her movements suddenly cautious. As more corn fell away, the shape emerged. A bundle wrapped tightly in oilcloth, the fabric darkened with age, but intact. It was wedged between layers of cobs, as if the corn itself had been used as insulation, protection. She stood very still, the bundle cradled in her hands. Her heartbeat quickened, a sharp contrast to the steady pace she had fallen into. There was no logical reason for alarm, yet unease crept up her spine. People did not hide things like this without purpose. She carried the bundle outside, setting it on an overturned crate where the light was better. For a long moment, she simply looked at it. The cloth was tied with twine, knotted securely. The care taken in its wrapping spoke of time and intention, of someone who had not been improvising. When she finally untied it, the contents revealed themselves slowly. Papers, folded and refolded, their edges yellowed and brittle. A stack of old photographs, bound together with a rubber band that crumbled at her touch. Newspaper clippings, carefully trimmed. A small notebook, its cover worn smooth, the pages inside filled with a familiar, angular handwriting, her grandfather's. The sight of it sent a strange chill through her. She had seen that handwriting before, on the few letters he had sent over the years, each one brief and factual. Here, though, the pages were dense, crowded with words, as if he had been afraid to leave anything unsaid. She began to read, without fully realizing she had decided to. Dates leapt out first, then names. Some were unfamiliar, others vaguely recognizable from childhood conversations she had half overheard. There were official documents among the papers, stamped and signed, their language formal and severe. One word appeared again and again, enough times to form a pattern she could not ignore. Accusation. She sat back heavily, the crate creaking beneath her weight. Her mind struggled to connect what she was reading with the quiet, withdrawn man she remembered. The documents spoke of an investigation, of allegations made decades earlier. They hinted at land disputes, at a disappearance that had unsettled the region for years. Her grandfather's name appeared in places she had never imagined it would, linked to words that carried legal and moral weight. She flipped through the photographs with shaking fingers. Black and white images of fields and fences, of men standing together in stiff poses, of land boundaries marked by wooden posts. On the back of one photograph, her grandfather had written a single date and a location. On another, a name crossed out so heavily the paper had nearly torn. The realization came slowly, like the onset of pain after an injury. This was not memorabilia. This was evidence. She looked back toward the corn crib, its dark interior suddenly altered in her perception. What she had assumed was neglect or stubbornness now took on a different meaning. The corn had not been left to rot out of apathy. It had been left because it served a purpose. It concealed. It protected. Her breath felt shallow. Questions crowded in, overlapping and insistent. Why had he kept this hidden? Why here, of all places? And why had no one ever spoken of it? She gathered the bundle again, this time with care bordering on reverence, and carried it into the house. The kitchen table, thick with dust, became her workspace. She wiped it down and laid the papers out, smoothing them as best she could. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the loose boards of the barn. Inside, time narrowed to the pages in front of her. Hours passed as she read, sorting the documents into rough piles. Official records, personal notes, articles reporting developments that seemed to stop abruptly, as if the story had lost public interest before reaching resolution. The deeper she went, the clearer one thing became. Whatever had happened all those years ago, it had not been simple, and it had not ended cleanly. By late afternoon, fatigue set in, not in her muscles this time, but in her thoughts. The weight of what she had found pressed down on her, heavy and unfamiliar. She had come here to dismantle a farm, to erase it from her life with a signature and a sale. Instead, she had uncovered a past that refused to stay buried. She stood at the window, looking out at the corn crib in the fading light. The structure seemed unchanged, but she was not. The building was no longer just an obstacle to be cleared. It was a container, a deliberate archive disguised as agricultural necessity. She knew, with a certainty that surprised her, that she could not simply throw the corn away now. Whatever lay hidden in that crib demanded attention. Ignoring it would be an act, not of practicality, but of choice. And choices, she was beginning to understand, had consequences that extended far beyond property lines. As darkness settled over the farm, she closed the curtains and gathered the papers into a single stack, tying them carefully with fresh twine. Sleep did not come easily that night. Her mind replayed the images she had seen, the words she had read, weaving them into questions that had no answers yet. Outside, the corn crib stood silent, holding what remained of its secret, waiting for her to return. Morning arrived reluctantly, filtered through a low gray sky that pressed down on the farm and made the land seem flatter, heavier. She woke with the uncomfortable sensation that she had not fully left the previous day behind, that the documents spread across the kitchen table still occupied some part of her mind, even in sleep. For a few seconds, she lay still, listening to the old house settle, the quiet punctuated by faint creaks that sounded almost deliberate. Then memory returned in a rush, and with it the weight of what she had found. She made coffee and carried the mug to the table, standing over the papers as if they might rearrange themselves overnight into something simpler. They did not. The handwriting, the stamps, the dates were all still there, patient and unmoved. She sat down and began again, this time with more care, less urgency. If these pages were to mean anything, she would have to understand them fully, not as fragments, but as a whole. She started by sorting them chronologically. The earliest documents were decades old, their edges soft from handling, the ink faded, but legible. They spoke of land boundaries, of surveys conducted and disputed, of minor disagreements that seemed ordinary enough for a rural community, where land was both livelihood and legacy. Her grandfather's name appeared in these early records, without any particular emphasis, just another farmer navigating the complexities of ownership and inheritance. Then the tone shifted. A missing signature here, a delayed filing there. Small irregularities that would have meant nothing to her if she had not been looking for them. She cross-referenced dates, matched them against newspaper clippings. The pattern emerged slowly, like an image developing in a dark room. Something had changed abruptly in the year the accusations began. The clippings were the most difficult to read. They were written in the clipped, confident language of local reporting, heavy on implication and light on verification. A man had disappeared. A land deal had been contested. Suspicion had settled quickly, and once it did, it had not moved. Her grandfather's name was mentioned alongside words that carried a moral verdict long before any legal conclusion. There were no follow-up articles proclaiming guilt or innocence, only a gradual fading of coverage, as if the story had grown inconvenient. She leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. She tried to reconcile this public image with her private memories. The man who fixed broken chairs rather than buying new ones, who fed stray animals without comment, who never defended himself when family members spoke of him with thinly veiled discomfort. Had this been why? Had he learned, early on, that explanations were useless once a narrative had taken hold? By midday, she had filled an entire notebook with notes of her own. Questions outnumbered answers. But one thing was becoming clear. The case against her grandfather had rested on assumption as much as evidence. Witness statements were referenced, but not included. Key documents were missing. Land that had once been his was now owned by someone else, someone whose name appeared repeatedly in the margins of her grandfather's notes, always accompanied by short, sharp observations. She decided she could not understand this story from paper alone. That afternoon, She drove into town for the first time since arriving. The place had changed less than she expected. The main street still consisted of a handful of shops clustered together, their signs faded but familiar. People moved at an unhurried pace, stopping to talk in doorways, their conversations pausing when she passed. She felt their eyes on her, measuring, recognizing something in her face she did not yet understand herself. She started at the small local library, a narrow building with tall windows and shelves that smelled faintly of dust and glue. The librarian looked up as she entered, her expression polite but reserved. When she asked for old newspapers, the woman hesitated, then gestured toward a back room without comment. It was not refusal, but it was not encouragement either. She spent hours there, scrolling through microfilm, scanning headlines that spoke of weather and crop yields and county meetings. When she found the articles she was looking for, they confirmed what she had already seen in the clippings. The reporting was shallow, repetitive, almost lazy. No one had pushed for clarity. No one had asked why the investigation stalled, why charges were never formally filed, yet suspicion lingered as if they had been. Leaving the library, she felt a subtle shift in the way people looked at her. A man outside the grocery store studied her openly, his gaze sharp with recognition. Inside, conversations fell quiet as she moved down the aisles. She heard her grandfather's name spoken once, low and dismissive, followed by a murmur she could not make out. The weight of inherited judgment pressed against her chest. At the hardware store, an older woman rang up her purchase and paused when she saw the address on the credit card slip. Her mouth tightened, then relaxed into something that might have been pity. "You're staying out there?" she asked, her tone carefully neutral. "For now," she replied. The woman nodded once. It's a lonely place. That evening, back at the farm, she noticed tire tracks near the fence that had not been there before. They were faint, already softening in the dirt, but unmistakable. Someone had driven past slowly, perhaps stopped. She stood for a long moment, staring at them, her mind racing through possibilities. Curiosity, she told herself. Nothing more. The thought did little to calm her. The next day brought her first direct confrontation. She was in the yard, clearing debris near the house, when a pickup truck pulled up and stopped just short of the fence. The man who stepped out was tall and broad-shouldered, his movements deliberate. He did not smile. "You must be his granddaughter," he said, as if stating a fact that required no confirmation. She nodded, wary. "I heard you were asking questions," he continued, digging into old things. "I'm trying to understand what happened," she said carefully. He studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Some things don't need understanding. They're done." "Not everything was done," she replied, surprising herself with the firmness of her voice. His gaze hardened. "Your grandfather got what he deserved." The words landed with a dull finality. She felt anger flare, sharp and unexpected. "You're sure about that?" she asked. He shrugged. "Everyone around here is." With that, he returned to his truck and drove away, leaving behind a cloud of dust that took its time settling. She stood alone in the yard, her hands clenched, heart pounding. The exchange confirmed what the documents suggested. The past was not simply forgotten here, it was actively defended. That night, her phone rang as she was reviewing her notes. The real estate agent's voice was apologetic. He had spoken to a potential buyer, he said, but there were concerns. "The property has a history," he explained, as if she were unaware. "It might take longer than expected to find the right person." After the call ended, she stared at the dark screen. The farm was resisting her attempts to dispose of it, not through legal barriers, but through something more insidious: reputation, memory, fear. Sleep came fitfully. She dreamed of corn spilling endlessly from the crib, burying the house, the fields, the road leading away. She woke before dawn, unsettled and exhausted, and went outside to breathe in the cold air. The corn crib stood as it always had, silent and solid, its presence now unmistakably intentional. By the end of the third day, she could no longer pretend that this was a temporary inconvenience. The documents on her table were not inert. They were part of a story that had shaped this place and the people in it, including herself. Ignoring them would mean accepting the version of events that had condemned her grandfather to decades of isolation. She gathered the papers into a neat stack and tied them once more. Her initial plan to sell the farm and leave quietly had begun to unravel, replaced by something she had not anticipated, a growing sense of obligation. Not to the land, not even to her grandfather, as she had known him, but to the truth that had been buried so carefully, layer by layer, beneath years of silence. As she stood at the window, watching the first light creep across the fields, she understood that the next step would demand more than curiosity. It would require a choice, one that would not be easily undone. The shadow of the past had lengthened, stretching toward her, and she knew now that it would follow her wherever she went, unless she turned to face it. The sense of obligation that had taken root in her mind did not announce itself loudly. It settled instead like a persistent pressure, a weight that made ordinary decisions feel heavier than they should have been. She moved through the days with a strange dual awareness, part of her still following the practical routines of clearing and sorting, while another part remained fixed on the stack of papers tied neatly on the kitchen table. Every glance in their direction carried the same question, unspoken but insistent. What would it cost to keep going? She began to study the documents with a different intent now. No longer content with simply understanding what had happened, she started to look for how it had been made to happen. She compared signatures across different forms, tracing the subtle variations in handwriting, the inconsistencies that suggested haste or imitation. Dates that had once seemed inconsequential took on new meaning when placed beside one another. A filing submitted days after a deadline, a notice delivered too late to be acted upon, a witness statement referenced in official correspondence but never attached. The more closely she looked, the more the structure of the accusation revealed itself as something fragile, propped up by assumptions and reinforced by silence. Her grandfather's notes became invaluable here. They were not polished arguments, not meant for anyone else's eyes. They were raw, sometimes repetitive, filled with frustration and careful observation. He had written names in the margins, circled them, crossed them out, then written them again. One name appeared more often than any other, always accompanied by short phrases that hinted at motive and opportunity, without ever stating them outright. That man, she learned, had owned land adjacent to her grandfather's. After the accusations, his holdings had expanded rapidly. Boundaries shifted in ways that benefited him alone. Transactions that should have raised questions had passed without comment. The pattern was unmistakable once she allowed herself to see it. Her grandfather had not been the beneficiary of wrongdoing. He had been its obstacle. At night, she sat alone in the kitchen, the overhead light casting sharp shadows on the walls, and imagined her grandfather here decades earlier, sorting these same papers, reaching the same conclusions, and then stopping. The thought unsettled her more than the documents themselves. Why had he never gone further? Why hide the evidence rather than present it? The answer, she suspected, lay not in cowardice but in calculation. He had lived here, surrounded by people who already believed the worst of him. To accuse someone else would have required allies he did not have, protection he could not count on. He had chosen, instead, to survive quietly, preserving the truth in the only way available to him. He had trusted time to do what confrontation could not. That trust had been misplaced, or perhaps merely delayed. The first overt threat came on a Thursday evening. She returned from town to find the back door ajar, its frame splintered where it had been forced. Inside, drawers were pulled out and left open, their contents scattered across the floor. Nothing of obvious value was missing. The television still sat in its corner. The small amount of cash she kept in her bag was untouched. The only thing disturbed with any deliberation was the kitchen table. The stack of papers was gone. She stood very still, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain it could be heard beyond the walls. For several seconds, she could not move, could not think beyond the simple, paralyzing fact of absence. Then she noticed the twine, cut cleanly, lying on the floor beneath the table, and beside it, partially hidden beneath a chair, the papers themselves, shoved hastily into a pile. Whoever had been here hadn't taken them. They had looked through them and left them behind. The message was unmistakable. She locked the door, hands trembling, and sat on the edge of the couch until the adrenaline subsided enough for her to breathe normally. The violation was intimate in a way she had not expected. This was not a random act of vandalism or theft. It was targeted, deliberate, meant to unsettle rather than destroy. That night, sleep was impossible. Every sound carried significance. The wind against the siding sounded like footsteps. The settling of the house became a series of warnings. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the events of the past days with relentless clarity. She thought of the man who had confronted her by the fence, of the looks she had received in town, of the tire tracks she had dismissed too easily. She understood now that curiosity was not being tolerated here. It was being monitored. The following morning, she considered leaving. The thought came suddenly, with the seductive clarity of escape. She could pack the documents into her car, drive away, and hand them over to someone else far from this place. Or she could simply destroy them, as others clearly wished she would, and close the door on the entire chapter. The farm could still be sold. Her life could return to its carefully constructed distance from the past. She stood in front of the corn crib again, the structure unchanged, indifferent to her turmoil. She ran her hand along the rough wood, feeling the grooves worn by decades of weather. This, she realized, had been her grandfather's last line of defense. He had chosen this place not because it was obvious, but because it was ordinary. No one questioned a corn crib filled with corn. No one imagined that the most damning truths could be hidden in plain sight, disguised as neglect. The weight of that realization pressed heavily on her. To walk away now would not be a neutral act. It would be a continuation of the silence that had defined her grandfather's life after the accusation. She would be choosing safety at the cost of truth, just as he had, but without the same constraints. The difference mattered. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, startling her. It was her brother. She hesitated before answering, suddenly unsure how much she could or should say. He listened quietly as she spoke, her words cautious, measured. When she finished, there was a long pause on the line. "You don't owe him this," he said finally. "You don't owe any of them." "I know," she replied, "but I owe myself something. I think I always have." He did not argue. He understood her better than she had expected. Before they hung up, he said one thing that stayed with her. "Be careful. This place doesn't forget." The days that followed were marked by a heightened awareness of risk. She backed up the documents digitally, scanning each page and storing copies in multiple locations. She drove to a neighboring county to use a public scanner, careful not to attract attention. She began to research journalists and legal professionals who had experience reopening old cases, people whose reputations were built on persistence rather than convenience. Every step forward seemed to invite a corresponding pushback. Anonymous notes appeared in her mailbox, their messages vague but unmistakably threatening. A stranger approached her in the parking lot outside the grocery store, advising her, in a tone that suggested concern rather than menace, to let sleeping dogs lie. Even the real estate agent stopped returning her calls. Fear became a constant companion, but it did not paralyze her as she had expected. Instead, it sharpened her focus. She stopped imagining worst-case scenarios and began to think in terms of contingencies. What mattered now was not comfort, but momentum. The longer the truth remained confined to her possession, the more vulnerable it was. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the fields in muted gold, she sat at the kitchen table with the papers spread before her and made her decision. It was not dramatic. There was no single moment of revelation. It was simply the quiet acceptance of a path that had been unfolding since she first pulled that bundle from the corn. She would take the truth beyond this place. She would put it into hands less easily intimidated, into systems that, however flawed, operated on principles broader than local loyalty and inherited silence. The cost would be real. She could feel it already, in the tightening of her chest, in the way she flinched at unexpected sounds. But there was a different cost to doing nothing, one she now understood with painful clarity. As darkness settled over the farm, she gathered the papers once more, her movements careful and deliberate. The corn crib stood outside, its role fulfilled at last. It had guarded the truth through years of neglect and judgment. Now it was her turn to decide what to do with what had been entrusted, silently, to the future. The price of truth, she knew, was never fixed. It was paid in stages, measured not only in danger and loss, but in the relinquishing of comfort and certainty. Standing there, alone with the weight of her choice, she understood that whatever lay ahead, there would be no returning to the simple intention with which she had first arrived. The past had demanded its due, and she had answered. She did not leave the farm immediately after making her decision. That surprised her, even as she recognized the necessity of it. The truth she carried had waited decades. It could wait a few more days while she prepared to release it properly. Rash action, she understood now, would serve no one. What she needed was distance without disappearance, exposure without recklessness. The choice she had made required patience as much as courage. The first step was contact. She drove 2 counties over to a town large enough to feel anonymous, where no one knew her name or her grandfather's. In a quiet cafe near the courthouse, she made the call she had been postponing. One journalist declined politely, citing current commitments. Another listened, asked careful questions, and then asked for time. The third, a woman whose byline she recognized from investigations that had stretched over years rather than weeks, agreed to meet. They sat across from each other at a small table, papers spread between them, coffee growing cold as the journalist read and reread sections, occasionally pausing to ask a precise, unsettlingly perceptive question. She did not rush the conversation. She had learned, through bitter observation, that truth revealed too quickly was often dismissed as emotion. She let the documents speak. "This is solid," the journalist said finally, her voice low but certain. "Not complete, but solid enough to reopen questions that were never properly closed." "What happens next?" she asked. "That depends," the journalist replied. "Once this becomes public, there will be resistance. There always is. People who benefited from silence rarely surrender it willingly." "I know," she said. She thought of the broken door frame, the anonymous notes, the careful warnings. "I've already seen some of that." The journalist nodded. "Then you understand that this won't be quick or gentle." They agreed on terms that afternoon. Copies were exchanged, safeguards discussed. The journalist promised discretion until the initial verification was complete. When they parted, It was with the unspoken understanding that something irreversible had begun. The waiting that followed was worse than fear. Days passed in a strange suspension, each one stretching long and thin. She returned to the farm, but did not resume the work of clearing it. Instead, she walked the boundaries of the land, seeing it now through a different lens. This place had not merely been the setting of her grandfather's exile. It had been the instrument of it. The land itself had been contested, manipulated, transformed into evidence against him. She began to notice details she had overlooked before. Fence posts that did not align with older survey maps. A corner of the field that bore marks of heavy machinery inconsistent with its apparent use. Small things, perhaps, but together they formed a quiet confirmation of what the documents suggested. The truth was embedded here, written into the soil as surely as it was recorded on paper. The first article appeared 2 weeks later. It was cautious, meticulously worded, framed as an inquiry rather than an accusation. It did not declare her grandfather innocent outright. Instead, it asked questions that had not been asked before. Why had no charges ever been filed? Why had key evidence gone missing? Why had land ownership shifted so dramatically in the aftermath of an unresolved investigation? The reaction was immediate. Phone calls flooded the journalist's office. Some were outraged, others defensive, a few unexpectedly relieved. In town, the article circulated with the speed of something long anticipated. She heard about it from a neighbor who stopped her at the edge of her property, his manner uncertain. "They're talking about it again," he said, as if surprised. "People don't like it." "People didn't like it then either," she replied. He nodded slowly. "No, they didn't." Within days, officials were forced to respond. Statements were issued that emphasized the age of the case, the difficulty of reassessing evidence so long after the fact. But the journalist persisted, publishing follow-up pieces that laid out the inconsistencies with relentless clarity. Old witnesses were located. Some refused to speak. Others, freed by time and shifting loyalties, began to tell versions of events that did not match the accepted narrative. One name surfaced again and again, the same name her grandfather had written so often in the margins of his notes. The man was long dead, but his influence remained, preserved through the wealth and property he had accumulated. His heirs issued denials. Lawyers appeared. Threats of defamation suits were whispered, then spoken aloud. She watched all of this from a distance that felt both protective and isolating. She had become, without intending to, a central figure in a public reckoning. Her name appeared in articles, cautiously at first, then more openly, as her role became impossible to ignore. Some portrayed her as a dutiful granddaughter seeking justice. Others suggested less generous motives. She learned quickly that once truth entered the public sphere, it ceased to belong entirely to those who uncovered it. The legal review began quietly. Files were retrieved from archives. Old decisions were scrutinized under modern standards. What had once been dismissed as circumstantial was reevaluated in light of new context. The absence of formal charges, once seen as a technicality, now appeared damning in its own way. A man's life had been effectively ruined without the burden of proof ever being met. She was called to give a statement, then another. Each time she spoke carefully, grounding her words in documents and dates rather than emotion. It was exhausting, but she understood the necessity of restraint. Rage, however justified, would only undermine the credibility she had fought to establish. Months passed. The seasons shifted almost unnoticed. The fields around the farm grew greener, then duller again, mirroring the slow, grinding progress of the investigation. She remained on the land longer than she had planned, anchored by a sense of responsibility she could no longer disentangle from her presence there. Leaving now would feel like abandonment. The day the decision was announced arrived without ceremony. A brief press conference, A statement read from prepared notes. The conclusion was careful, legalistic, but unmistakable in its implications. The original investigation had been deeply flawed. Evidence had been mishandled. Assumptions had replaced due process. Her grandfather was formally cleared of wrongdoing. There was no apology. None was expected. She read the announcement alone at the kitchen table, the same table where the papers had first been spread. The words blurred for a moment as something inside her loosened. It was not triumph, she felt, but release. A tension she had not known how to name dissolved, leaving behind a quiet, almost hollow calm. In town, reactions were mixed. Some expressed belated sympathy. Others remained silent, their acceptance private if it existed at all. The truth, she learned, did not compel reconciliation. It only made denial harder. She visited her grandfather's grave the following week. The marker was simple, weathered, bearing only his name and dates. She stood there for a long time, uncertain what to say. There was no dramatic speech, no declaration of victory. She spoke instead of ordinary things, of the farm, of the corn crib, of the years he had endured without vindication. "It's done now," she said quietly. "You're clear." The wind moved through the trees, carrying no answer. She did not expect one. When she returned to the farm, she walked to the corn crib at dusk. The structure stood as it always had, its purpose fulfilled. She felt no urge to dismantle it now. It had earned its place. It was no longer a hiding place, but a testament to endurance, to the stubborn belief that truth, even when buried, retained its power. The story did not end there, she knew. Consequences would continue to unfold. Lawsuits, debates, revisions of memory. But the central question, the one that had haunted the land for decades, had been answered. Her grandfather's name was no longer a shadow. As she stood in the fading light, she understood that the final act of this journey would not be about justice alone, but about choice. The truth had been released. The land, now unburdened by its past, waited for a future, and she would have to decide what role, if any, she would play in it. The farm felt different once the truth had been spoken aloud and recorded in places beyond memory and rumor. Nothing visible had changed. The house still leaned slightly. The barn still creaked when the wind pressed against it, and the fields remained stubbornly uneven, where years of neglect had left their mark. Yet the weight that had once seemed woven into the soil itself was gone. The land no longer felt like an accusation. It was simply land again, quiet and waiting. She noticed the change most clearly in herself. The constant vigilance that had governed her movements for months slowly eased. She slept through the night without startling awake at every sound. The tension in her shoulders softened, replaced by a fatigue that felt earned rather than imposed. The work ahead was no longer driven by fear or obligation, but by choice. In the days that followed the announcement, she received messages from people she had never met. Some thanked her for reopening a wound they had lived beside without naming. Others offered apologies that felt sincere, if belated. A few remained openly resentful, clinging to the version of events that had once allowed them to feel secure in their judgments. She learned to accept all of it without internalizing any single response. Truth, once released, traveled unevenly. Her brother arrived on a quiet afternoon, his car pulling into the drive with none of the hesitation she had expected. He stepped out slowly, taking in the house, the fields, the corn crib standing tall against the sky. He had not been here in years, not since he had decided that leaving was the only way to survive what the place represented. Now he stood in silence, hands in his pockets, as if reacquainting himself with an old acquaintance he had never fully understood. "It looks the same," he said finally. "It does," she replied. "But it isn't." They walked together, not speaking much at first. Words felt unnecessary, even intrusive. The land carried enough of the story on its own. She showed him the boundary markers she had rediscovered, the places where records and reality had failed to align. She took him into the house, pointing out small repairs she had made, evidence of her extended stay. He listened, asked questions, absorbed the details with a seriousness she had not seen in him before. They sat on the porch as the light began to fade, the air cooling around them. It was then that she told him what she had already decided. "I'm not staying," she said simply. He nodded, unsurprised. "I didn't think you would." "But I don't want to sell it either," she continued. "Not now. Not like that." He turned to look at her, waiting. "This place deserves better than being reduced to a transaction," she said. "And I know I'm not the one who can give it that." The silence that followed was heavy but not uncomfortable. He looked out over the fields, his gaze lingering on the far edge of the property where the land dipped and rose again. When he spoke, his voice was steady. "I've thought about coming back," he admitted. "More than once. I just didn't think I had the right." "You do," she said. "If you want it." He did not answer immediately. The decision, she understood, was not simple. Returning meant confronting memories he had worked hard to bury, taking on responsibility that would shape his life in ways he could not fully predict. It also meant reclaiming something that had been taken, not through force, but through silence. "I want to try," he said at last. The legal process was straightforward, almost anticlimactic. The paperwork that transferred the farm from her name to his was clean, unburdened by the complications that had once seemed inevitable. As they signed, she felt no regret. The act did not feel like loss, but like completion. In the weeks that followed, her brother began the slow work of restoration. He repaired fences, cleared sections of the fields, assessed what machinery could be salvaged and what would have to be replaced. He moved with a quiet determination that reminded her, unexpectedly, of their grandfather. Not in manner or temperament, but in persistence. The corn crib remained untouched. She asked him once if he planned to empty it, to dismantle the structure now that its secret was no longer needed. He shook his head. "No," he said. "It can stay. It's part of the place." She understood. The corn crib no longer functioned as a hiding place, but it had become something else entirely. A marker. A reminder that endurance did not always look like resistance, and that survival sometimes took the form of waiting. On her final morning at the farm, she rose early and walked the property one last time. The air was crisp, carrying the promise of change. She paused at the corn crib, resting her hand against the wood, feeling the solidity of it beneath her palm. It had held the truth when no one else would. It had waited. She left without ceremony. No lingering glance back, no dramatic farewell. The road unfolded ahead of her, familiar and yet newly open. As the farm disappeared behind her, she felt a quiet certainty settle in its place. Some stories ended not with triumph or defeat, but with restoration. The land remained, tended now by someone who belonged to it. The truth remained, no longer hidden, no longer alone. And she carried with her not the burden of what had been uncovered, but the knowledge that even the longest silence could be broken, and that what was buried, when given time and courage, could still find its way into the light. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to the channel. Watch the next video and explore other stories here. Share this video with someone who might need it.